All right, everyone. My special guest tonight is Professor Adolph Reed Jr. He's an American Professor Emeritus of Political Science at the University of Pennsylvania, specializing in studies of issues of racism and U.S. politics. Welcome, welcome. I have so many questions to ask you.
Okay, well, let's get on.
So one of the things that I focus on a lot on this show is the class issue.
Mhm.
I have explained to my audience multiple times that if you're poor, I feel it doesn't really matter if you're on the left or the right, because at the end of the day, you're still poor.
Right.
So I'm trying to encourage people to focus more so on the billionaires and the top 1% and not so much on left versus right. And I want to get your opinion about that. Like, how do you think we can successfully, I guess, change people's focus in a way?
Right. Well, I tell you, I mean, one thing is that the left-right dichotomy has been stripped of meaning over the last 40 years anyway. Right. If a long time ago, Christopher Hitchens, when he and I were friendly, told me that he had auditioned for the left chair on Crossfire. And this was during the Clinton administration. But they told him that as a leftist, the boundary of the left, what was that he couldn't criticize Clinton. Right. And so at this point, like, I mean, you think about what the left is supposed to be in the Democratic Party, and we know what the right is. But yeah, I mean, your first point is the key point, right? That the categories don't have any meaning. They certainly don't have any meaning that directly addresses people's lives. So as a rule, when I'm talking to working people, I don't talk about the left or the right anyway. I mean, and that's what we do. If you don't mind the shameless plug for our podcast, classmatterspodcast.org. But when we talk to working people, we don't talk about left and right. We talk about concrete material issues. And I caught a bit of your observation about preferring ballot initiatives, and I think that's a better way for us to try to approach the electoral stuff. Because one of the things that we've noticed, at least in the last I was going to say at least in the last 3 or 4 months, but really throughout COVID, is that working people have by and large seem to have lost trust in government.
Yep.
And that makes sense because everybody's lying to them all the time, right? Like, from like on the liberal left side of things, right? Those increasingly hysterical emails that we all got during the Senate race last time around that tried to convince us that Jamie Harrison actually had a snowball's chance in hell of beating, almost call him Strom Thurmond, but I mean Lindsey Graham, right, the trans Thurmond. But anyway, but for all that kind of stuff, right, lying and not following through. So where we can have some impact, or have to hope to have some impact, is on talking to people about the concrete issues that they're concerned about, right? And yeah, I mean, so I completely agree that the debate between left and right is totally beside the point, and especially now that we're one morning sleeping through the alarm clock away from a fascist coup in this country, basically. So.
Agreed. I know one of the criticisms that we've received over at RBN is people say when we make that argument, like we did the marches for Medicare for All last year.
Oh yeah.
We were like 50 cities in the country.
Mm-hmm.
So when we did that, like people were mad at us because they said, how dare you march with conservatives? And I said, well, conservatives need health care too.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I mean, if you want to see that I've been saying for decades now that we have to stop treating the movement, which doesn't exist in the first place, but we have to stop treating it like it's a frat, right? Like you don't have to show that you have all the secret words and use all the right language and adopt a secret handshake or whatever, but to be part of a movement for making this country better for people. And in fact, that's the best shot that we have to try to take away the scapegoating that the right wing actually lives on, and it's getting like more and more obvious and blatant. It seems like almost daily, right? I mean but right, there's a new scapegoat every day, right? Grooming kids now, right? It is like a charge that they toss around. They don't even need to propose anything that even pretends to be evidence. They just have to say the word and it sticks. And like we've got to. And I mean, the Democrats aren't any better, right? I mean, obviously, right? It's clear now that Biden, and I've had to catch myself increasingly over the last 2 or 3 weeks from calling him Bush, but that Biden has decided that he's going to run against Trump, Putin, and Alito, and maybe China now too, right? And I've been saying to friends, it's just really telling. The extent to which the Democrats will go, like this is risking blowing up the world, but the extent to which they'll go to keep from doing anything to make working people's lives better. And it also answers the question, which again I've been saying since 2016, that wing of the Democratic Party is more frightened of a working class politics.
Yeah.
Than it is of fascism. And they've made that clear too.
Agreed. I want to show you a study that came out of Princeton. I've shown this before on the show, but I try to show it multiple times when new people come in.
Yeah.
But this was a study that was done that came from Princeton. Now, this is from Professor Martin Gillens. I'm going to connect to
Martin Gillens, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so you're probably familiar with this. But he did the study, and what he found was that when it came to actual policy change, so he had 2 graphs here, one for people who are low income and one for people who are middle income. And what he shows you is that when it comes to actual policy change, nothing really happens for people who are low income and people who are middle income. It's a straight line. Actually, right. Someone pointed out the middle income one time. They said it actually looks like it dips a little bit. But for people who are high income, they actually have a greater percentage of policy change.
Right. Well, that makes sense. I mean, look, it's consistent with the finding that wealth and income have become increasingly polarized in this country over the last 50 years plus. I mean, and that's another reason that people don't have any faith in government, and don't get anything out of it. But on the other hand, people who are well off and have money do get stuff out of government, so they like it. It's kind of straightforward.
Agreed. And that leads me to the Democratic Party and their connection to Wall Street, because we've been doing this strategy for the past couple of years of putting like progressives through the Democratic Party. And right. Look, I donated to Bernie Sanders and the squad, all of them. And I haven't seen them do anything, like really fight for the people. Right. And so I did some digging on my own on Open Secrets and other sites to see who is donating money to this party. And what I found is that even though some of the politicians may have run on grassroots campaigns, it still kind of doesn't matter, because they're going into a party where the leaders of that party take corporate money. So like Nancy Pelosi still takes corporate money, right. And she's the Speaker of the House.
Right. Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, part of the problem is, and I don't lay any of this at Bernie Sanders' feet, right? Like he did the thing that he set out to do, and he was more successful in 2020, in my view, than he was in 2016, insofar as an objective was to create space for people who were inclined to organize around a working class politics at the grassroots level, could get some attention and could do it, right? And that was a big victory, I think, in 2020. We came out of the 2020 primaries stronger than we had been, like, in a long time, like at that level. We worked in South Carolina, and we did a public education campaign around the healthcare crisis, coincident with the South Carolina primary. And like we wound up, getting or having more than 18,000 people, mainly Black, mainly working class, signing pledge cards saying that they would prefer not to only to vote for candidates who supported Medicare for all. Beyond that, when they started talking about the possibility of having healthcare as a right, they started talking about having other stuff as a right, like post-secondary public education, right, or right to housing, right, or $20 an hour, living wage, or whatever. The pandemic undercut a lot of that initiative that people had going. But so that's Bernie, right? The squad and the rest of that stuff, and like DSA also. The kind of naive sensibility is that you can elect your way out of class struggle, basically, right? Or for the DSA types, that you can elect your way to socialism, right?
Mm-hmm.
One of my frustrations for a long time has been this kind of short-term, quick fix ad agency sort of consciousness, right? Even among people who consider themselves to be progressive. So you may recall 6 or 7 years before AOC that there was Kshama Sawant who got elected to the Seattle City Council. And then everybody all over the country was talking about how we can model what Kshama Sawant did. And it doesn't work that way. But even with like the Justice Democrats and the Progressive Democrats strategy, so take the districts from which people like AOC get elected, right? They're safe Democratic districts, so that means you're not picking up any new seats, really. There's a more or less progressive or energetic or challenger who's able to beat a long-term incumbent who has seen the demographic composition of the district change, right, underneath him or her. And how many seats are there like that in the House of Representatives? Like 20, right? So like this isn't a strategy that's going to turn the tables for us. But most of all, I just said this at the Buffalo DSA convention Sunday, that I lost my point. It's going to come back to me in a second. Don't worry about it. But that, oh yeah. So you win in a seat like that, right? There are, like I said, there may be 20 of them, right? Here's my point. That I was really impressed by and sort of proud of the Progressive Caucus in the House, during the fight around Build Back Better, right? Because among other things, they succeeded, I think, in shifting the corporate news infotainment industry's principal narrative. Right, their reflex was, well, the progressives just need to shut up and stop demanding stuff and act like adults and get behind Biden. They did a very good and forceful job, as you recall, of showing that they were both carrying the administration's water for it, right? So like they weren't fighting against the administration, but also making the point very, very clearly that the nature of the political challenges that face us now, the threats, are such that if the Democrats want to have any chance of doing anything, they've got to deliver real, palpable, concrete stuff to the great masses of working people. So they took control of the narrative, and they played the inside game very, very well, right? About as well as it can be played. They were very clever. Khanna and Jayapal and the others, Cori Bush. But what happened was when Manchin and Sinema, decided to go outside, right, the Beltway, and to act, not within the rules of the game, but forcefully to advance, the interests of their constituency back home, that is the corporate constituency. the Democratic caucus or the progressive Dems didn't have a response, right? So from my perspective, right, at that moment, they should have been able to go outside the Beltway and mobilize their own constituents back home to do something like have 500,000 people sit down on the 14th Street Bridge and block access to DC, right? But they don't have that kind of constituency because they've been building a movement electorally, right? Like they don't, right? But it's not rooted right institutionally, like in unions or in community groups or like any other bodies that can actually mobilize a mass constituent base. So on the one hand, you get this, I'm giving $5 to a Democrat is like feeding a stray cat, right? So I get 40 emails a day, right, from this one in Colorado and that one in Texas and everywhere else, asking for money. But it's always the same thing. Like if we can just elect more Democrats, then we'll turn the tide. But that's simply just not the way the politics works.
Yes, and I feel like Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema are like rotating villains, just because if it's not them, then it's the Senate parliamentarian that I had never heard of until last year. When Kamala Harris is the clear tiebreaker, she defers to the Senate parliamentarian. And when Obama was in office, I felt like it was Lieberman. It's always someone.
Oh yeah, no. I mean, that's a very important point too, right? That's a very important point because it always is, right? It's always the devil made me do it, and it's been like that since Bill Clinton. Every Democratic president since Jimmy Carter has been elected on a promise to push labor law reform to tilt the playing field somewhat back in the direction of working people, and every one of them has sold it out, and they've all sold it out the same way, right? The pitiful, sorry, I almost said a bad word, but they mess around for 2 years and then lose control of Congress and then say, oh, well, the Republicans wouldn't let me do it, right? And this was Clinton or Carter, Clinton, Obama, Biden, right? It's all the same thing. And you think the game would get kind of old, right? The people, granted, Charlie Brown never stopped trying to kick the football, but it's not that they're stupider than we are, right? And it's not that they don't want to win. So there's something else going on with the Democrats that progressives need to take. Leftists, right? There's no left in this country, but there are leftists that leftists need to start taking into account and to make sense of, right, as to why they keep doing the same thing over and over again, right?
I'm sure you heard about what happened with Nina Turner's run this time around. This is her second time running. The squad kind of like abandoned her, basically.
Right. Well, look, I mean, here's the problem too. We tend, like, the flip side of the coin of exaggerating the potential for victories or the significance of victories is a tendency to underestimate the opposition. Like my classic illustration of this was the Seattle WTO, right, demos in 1999, right? They caught the WTO completely, the World Trade Organization, completely by surprise, shut down the city, couldn't get any work done. And then all of our forces are thinking, okay, well, this is the new movement. No, like this had to make an adjustment, right? They go meet on an island, right, 50 miles off the coastline of somewhere, right, that you can only access by helicopter. I mean, the squad had something of an element of surprise about them. But the other side knows about this strategy now, and they mobilized against it. And I mean, Nina had other stuff, going against her too. Like Martha Fudge hated her. They've had enmity going back a long time. And you knew once Fudge gets into the Biden administration, and Clyburn, right? Nina came up against Clyburn twice in South Carolina, and we all know what he is, right? And so we should know that, that they're going to bring out the big guns, right? So we shouldn't underestimate what we're up against either.